Greetings and welcome to the podcast. This is Historia Cambriae Antiquae, and I'm your host, Luke. This is the podcast where we talk about medieval Welsh history and the uniqueness that is Wales in the early Middle Ages. From grand legends to complex dynastic histories, this podcast tries to unravel a history that is far too often overshadowed by Wales's Germanic neighbor. As opposed to the more common Anglo-centric podcast, this podcast aims to be Cambro-centric. With that, let's get cracking on the episode. The myth of King Arthur is one that has been adapted into every media imaginable. Literary works were the first form that we know of, but as video became available, movie adaptations of the legendary King of the Britons were quick to follow, with the first of these being A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is a film adaptation of Mark Twain's book, which in turn is an adaptation of the original Arthurian legend told by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, which in turn is an adaptation of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is even further inspired by disparate tales of Welsh folklore about a warrior named Arthur. It's fairly easy to see at this point how complicated and how more so convoluted this story gets with age. And I even skipped plenty of pivotal steps that help solidify the more modern Arthur narrative. In this podcast, we'll be looking into the historicity of the Arthur narrative and the ways in which the narrative changed in the early Middle Ages and beyond. Many people will be familiar with the Arthur narrative, a legendary king of Britain who is the epitome of all things chivalrous. He sits at the head of a large table of utterly virtuous knights who go on a tear up and down the countryside and engage in a slew of adventures that land them in various magical lands fighting equally magical beings, with the motive of the quest being more or less religious, but it seems that most of these knights are supposed to show a certain penchant for badassery, to use a convenient colloquialism. Now, I know that most of you have had these tales beaten over your head more or less subtly throughout your life, if you came from a traditional Western background. As such, I will not bore you with the most common elements of the modern Arthur narrative. In order to look into the historicity of Arthur and his daring knights, before we go on, I should explain that historicity means the historical accuracy of something. So, in order to look into the historicity of Arthur and his daring knights, we must first look into our titular character. To say that the historical records for a real Arthur are skimp would be a criminal understatement. From a historian's standpoint, there is truly nothing substantial in the claims of Arthur as a historical figure with any valuable, reliably recorded life events. But in some ways, this does not matter for his importance, which we'll get to later. With this in mind, let's look at the scant documents in which Arthur is mentioned. One of these sources is Historia Brittonum, which you'll remember if you watched the first episode. If you didn't, don't worry, I'm not mad, I'll explain it. Historia Brittonum was written in the 9th century by a Welsh cleric in the Kingdom of Gwynedd in North Wales. In the Historia Brittonum, the author lists multiple battles which the legendary Arthur was supposed to have fought in, including the Battle of Badon. In the 10th century, another source, Annales Cambriae, being the Annals of Wales, lists the Battle of Badon and the Battle of Camlan as important events in Wales's history. In the Battle of Camlan, it is recorded in this text that Arthur and Medrawd, who later becomes the legendary villain Mordred, are recorded to have fallen. Both of these sources list these battles as having taken place in the 6th century. It seems that the Battle of Badon was indeed a historical battle between Welsh and Anglo-Saxon forces, as the British monk Gildas wrote of the battle in his polemic De Excidio. Given Gildas's temporal proximity to these events, they could be more easily believed. Gildas, however, makes no mention of Arthur at any point throughout his writings. This seems to be a later addition to the narratives of these two battles, added at some point through the early Middle Ages. What could be the reason for Arthur's insertion into these narratives? What is the weight of his historical figure, and why do we see the inclusion of Arthur in the 9th century? We will have to look at the historical context of this time in order to truly understand it. In the 9th century, 828 has been given as a date for Historia Brittonum, there were a few factors that caused the inclusion of Arthur. It is likely that the tales that are the core part of his narrative, being fighting off foreign invaders, were solidified at this time. This is due in part because of the harrying of the Isles by foreign invaders such as the Vikings. Wales, however, was largely spared by the Vikings as it was one of the least accessible areas by terms of convenience. Another more familiar invader to the Arthur narrative was at work in the early 9th century too, as the Kingdom of Mercia, who held lands in the Midlands of what is now England, invaded Gwynedd, where the Historia Brittonum was written, and held significant control of the eastern portion of the kingdom until the Venedosian, being the adjectival form of Gwynedd, King Mervyn ap Gwriad was able to drive back the Mercians. This inclusion of Arthur in the Historia Brittonum could be an allusion to an early defender of the Welsh against the Anglo-Saxons, as Mervyn was a defender of the Welsh against the invading Saxon threat. The original Arthur narrative, however, is set in the sub-Roman period, when Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were first being established in Britain. Arthur is a stalwart and heroic defender against the onslaught. In the earliest texts, Arthur is not even mentioned as a king. He is first described as a war leader or a general of some sort. In one of the oldest Welsh texts, y Gododdin, attributed to Aneurin, the legendary bard hailing from the old Welsh kingdoms in the north of Britain, now known in Welsh as Erhenoglaeth, literally translated as the Old North, a warrior is described as being great, as he slew many Saxons in his day. Yet, the poet states that he was no Arthur, despite his fantastic achievement on the battlefield. Since y Gododdin comes from a 12th century manuscript, dating is an issue. Many scholars date this poem to the 600s, but some would attribute it to a later revision of an early text. As such, it is difficult to tell if his allusion to Arthur is the earliest mention of the character or if it was inserted at a later date. Through this tale, and the later Historiae Brittonum and Annales Cambriae, Arthur is not stated as a king. It is not until around the late 11th century, about 5 centuries after Arthur was supposed to have lived, that we see him described as a ruler. In 1138, the Norman cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth completed his Historia Regum Britanniae, known in English as the History of the Kings of Britain. The title is utterly baseless, as Geoffrey is famed for his pseudo-historical narrative throughout this text. In the Historia Regum Britanniae, Geoffrey gives a broad history of all the legendary rulers of the island of Britain, but the majority of this story focuses on Arthur and his exploits. Geoffrey seems to have had cobbled together all the native Welsh tales he could find on Arthur, and make up stories where the tales do not connect. Interestingly as well, Geoffrey moves the location of Arthur's chief court. In older tales, Arthur resides in Cornwall, at a place called Kellyweek. In Geoffrey's tale, Arthur's chief court resides at Caerleon, the site of significant Roman urbanization. It is perhaps less than a coincidence that Caerleon is in Monmouthshire, which gives Geoffrey his epithet of Monmouth. King Arthur in this telling is a heroic figure, but slightly less than the true chivalrous king we might expect him to be from more recent tellings. The largest solidification in the Arthur narrative comes from the French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who creates some stories for some of the lesser characters of the Arthur narrative and invents more characters. Writing in the mid to late 12th century, Chrétien kicks off a major portion of the Age of Chivalry by representing the major players in Arthur's court as virtuous soldiers and gracious rulers. This idea would later be adapted into all forms of medieval literature, but ultimately got its start from the Arthur narrative. In this way, the narrative of Arthur changed the literature of the Western world. As previously stated, Chrétien added many characters to this narrative. The most famous of these is Lancelot, who debuted in Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, and later went on to gain fame for his exploits with Arthur's wife Guinevere. Later literature by Chrétien gives Arthur's narrative a much more religious bent, with the search for the Holy Grail. Before Chrétien's tales, there is no large portion of the Arthur narrative where he dedicates time to holy artifacts or even religious pursuits. In fact, to the modern eye, Arthur may seem much less than Christian, with the 11th century native Welsh tale, Culhwch ac Olwen, having many supernatural elements and druid-like figures. Through Chrétien's tellings, Arthur becomes a chivalrous king ordained by God to quest with the members of his court. The next major step in the Arthur narrative, and the last one we'll be discussing today, comes by the name of Le Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur, written by Thomas Malory, an English knight and prisoner. Malory wrote his work in the 15th century, and the work was first published in 1485. In this work, Malory simply translates tales from early 13th century French manuscripts. Despite it not being truly original, this compilation of the Arthur narrative was massively popular and gained immense traction and renaissance in early modern Britain. Due to the resurgence of the character's popularity, Henry VII even named his firstborn son, who was born in 1486, Arthur, although he died before being able to succeed his father. This influence on even the royal family shows, despite their lineage being somewhat Welsh, that this narrative as Arthur as the rightful ruler of all Britain had gained traction even in England, who were Arthur's original supposed enemies in the Anglo-Saxons. The Arthur narrative has taken many twists and turns from whatever the original story perhaps would have been. As for this original story, we can only speculate. It seems that he was said to be a great warrior who defeated a great number of Anglo-Saxons in sub-Roman Britain. Past this, Anything about his original mythological character is at this point impossible to know. And as for his historical character, even less can be known, that is, if he even existed. As perhaps my favorite scholar, T.M. Charles Edwards, once said, at this stage of the inquiry, one can only say that there may well have been a historical Arthur, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him. Perhaps this is what makes Arthur so attractive to those looking to retell his tale. Since so little is known of him, it is easy to create or recreate a tale centering around him and his mythos. In terms of the later tellings of the legend, countless knights and other figures of the mythical Round Table provides an exemplary avenue where authors can insert their original characters to this myth. The prevalence of Arthur throughout our culture also provides a way in which modern tellers of the legend can critique society or the status quo by critiquing this tale and figure that has become so intertwined with modern culture while remaining set in a world detached from our modern society. This is the reason why we still see new adaptations of the Arthur myth to the present day. It is so versatile and has immense room for shifting and adding new characters, like has been done for more than a millennia. Arthur started as an early medieval Welsh legend, but has grown into an icon of the Western world. Many versions of his tale have been created and retold, and there are surely many more to come. There is truly no true tale of Arthur, and none that we know to be truly historically accurate. Perhaps this may change, but for now, Arthur will remain a legend. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you learned something new. I'm sorry if you're upset that this episode was a little shorter, but I figured that I could intertwine my other longer podcasts with shorter, more palatable ones like this. If you have issue with the format, please feel free to let me know. For now, though, this has been a podcast on the legend of Arthur, and here it ends.